And here today we have several speakers who are with us to give us their support in person. The first of which is Cannell from the Stop the War Coalition in Scotland. Yesterday, conference of the Stop the War Coalition unanimously backed us in our campaign.
Hi everybody, it's great to be here, and on behalf of the Stop the War Coalition in Scotland, I'd like to... It's not working.
It's fine.
Don't need it.
Don't need it.
Here.
You can hear okay. Okay, start again. I want to say on behalf of the Stop the War Coalition in Scotland that we send solidarity and support to the occupation. Yesterday in Glasgow, I know Martin was there, but there were well over 100 students from universities all over Scotland, many of whom had been involved in the occupations. And I want to come back to this, but it seems to me that what you're doing and what people have done in the last few weeks really marks a step change in solidarity with the Palestinians. And I think I want to say that for a couple of reasons, because for people who've campaigned over Palestine for a long time, it's sometimes been really quite hard to get the message across. And it's an absolute tragedy that the events in Gaza were at the beginning of this year were what actually brought it to the attention of many people almost for the first time. It should not have been the case that it took something like that to make people wake up and think. But nevertheless, the shift that it's made, the wave of occupations, the demonstrations, just the general mood. I remember going into work after the big demonstration in Edinburgh on the Monday, and people who I had no expectation of at all that they would actually be interested were actually saying, we saw about the demonstration, we should have been there, we should have been out with you. People who had never been on demonstrations in their life. And it has shifted the whole debate about Palestine. And it seems to me that's an issue of fundamental importance. And I don't think it's simply about what happened this year, because for the last decade now, if you're 20, late teens, early 20 and so on, you've grown up in a world where the British government has been involved in one military intervention around the world after another. Iraq, Afghanistan, the potential of Iran, and so on. It's become a part of the world in which we live. And it's part of the world in which we live in a really horrible way, in the sense that the strategic objectives of Britain and the United States, which Britain follows so closely, are bound up with maintaining a status quo in the Middle East, which is the absolute, and I can't think of a way to describe it really, but it's just inimical to any kind of human rights, because it's about actually keeping control, keeping power over a part of the world which had the fortune and the misfortune to have the most valuable commodity of the 20th century, and probably the 21st century too, oil. But there are two things happening, I think. First is that in Britain and in Europe and around the world, the solidarity movement with Palestine is growing in a way that it's never grown before. But it's also paralleled with something that's happening in the Middle East as well. Because for 2 years I've been to the International Anti-War Conference in Cairo, which is something that brings together people from Europe, United States, the Middle East, all those who are campaigning against war and imperialism. And what has been at the heart of that conference, both times, has been the strength of the democracy movement in Egypt. And the democracy movement in Egypt is one which is based, first of all, on the fact that Egypt is a fantastically undemocratic place. I mean, it's no accident that the two biggest recipients of US military aid are, number one, Israel, and number two, Egypt. And there are 2.5 million riot police in Cairo itself. It's a big city, but that's an awful lot of riot police. And many of them are around the conference when we meet. But the conference is absolutely full of young people, trade unionists, people who are campaigning for democracy, but also campaigning in solidarity with Gaza. And over the last few weeks, the Egyptian government has put in fantastic resources to try and suppress any kind of opposition to the government over Gaza, because the government is the government that's actually keeping the prison gates sealed at Rafah. Nevertheless, they haven't managed to do that. People have been hurt, people have been arrested, but nevertheless those protests are carried on. But they put so much resources in that when you squeeze something down in one place, it pops up somewhere else. And there's some fantastic footage on the internet of small towns in North Sinai where everybody in the town is out on the streets saying, "Free, free Palestine," and "Mubarak, shame on you." Now, say that in Egypt is something which gets you banged up in prison normally, immediately. That shows the depth of the movement that's in support of that. And actually, the whole rotten process of control of the Middle East has been based upon British, United States support for corrupt and vicious dictators. When they start to fall, part of the scaffolding that holds up the Israeli state and holds up the injustice for Palestinians will start to fall too. And so it seems to me that the movement here and the movement in the Middle East is altogether a part of something which seems to me a change is going to come. These are not simply small changes, they're actually historic changes that are taking place. When you live in history, it's always hard to see it happening. But I think we'll look back to this year and see that this was the year in which we began to make a difference in terms of Palestine. Because none of us want a situation where we go through the cycle of a few more fake peace talks, more annexations, more settlements, another squeeze of the vice in terms of the conditions under which Palestinians live. And in 3 years' time or 2 years' time, we're demonstrating again because there's bombing and war and so on. We actually do need a solution to the Middle East, and it is one that involves a real sharp break with the status quo that's kept Palestinians in exile, in misery, for more than 60 years since the Nakba. And I'd like to just say finally that the issue which has been at the heart of many of the university occupations about military funding is, in this country, absolutely critical, because it's made me sick at the end of the bombing when they started talking about, well, it would be a good thing to stop military supplies getting in. They were talking about to Hamas, of course, when it struck, and they were talking about blockades around the Gaza coast. I wondered whether they should have been talking about blockades around the Fife coast, for example, because actually at Glen Rothes, at Raytheon, in many of the electronics companies in Fife, in Glasgow, and elsewhere in Scotland, much of the military infrastructure that contributes to the Predator drones, to the F-16s, and so on, not the whole apparatus, not the planes themselves, but the electronics and lots of the basic infrastructure for them is actually manufactured here. If we were talking about arms embargoes, they should be starting here in Britain, in Scotland, in Fife actually, before they start talking about anywhere else. That would make a huge difference. And actually, universities are at the heart of that. And it's what you've done in bringing that to people's attention is absolutely fantastic. So thank you.